Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that where I live, I'm on Woonwurrung country, and I acknowledge the elders, past and present, and particularly I'm grateful for all they did for preserving, caring for country, and hope that I too could be as caring as they were. But today we're in a different context to where we were some months back when we were planning this. So I invite you all just to hold your hands out and hold in your hands all of those people and families who are struggling at present with COVID. And I've just heard that the people of Shepparton now have had an outbreak. So let's hold our colleagues, our families, our friends, and all around Australia struggling with this. Breathe in. And breathe out. We hold too the people of Afghanistan, and in particularly the women and the children. So we just hold them in our prayers, in our hearts, as we breathe in and we breathe out. And we hold too today John and Sandra. The news this week has been a big shock to everyone around the diocese, something many can't understand. And again, all we can do is hold our hands out in support of John and Sandra, pray God's blessing on them as we breathe in and we breathe out. This paper I've prepared today, I call it God's Dream for the World, was prepared with John some months back. So just know this is what John wanted you to hear today. Australians First Nation people speak of the dreaming, where life, land, place and country are all held reverently as one. The dreaming is one totality of experience, where lineal time of past and present has no meaning. Everything is an eternal now. As we try to express our experience of this now moment, we have to resort to storytelling, and stories or narratives introduce the concept of time, as we speak of before and after, of today and tomorrow. These human time words are our way of exploring God's eternal now. So today I'm going to use a great story told by people down through the centuries. You've heard this story before, you've even told it yourself, but I ask you to let this be a new telling as you participate in it just now. God's dream involved light and darkness, water and land, seeds and plants, birds, fish and animals. And God saw in two creatures an image of God's own self. And these two humans, male and female, were charged with being the dream carriers, to be fruitful, to be faithful, to be like God in bringing life and goodness and order into creation. In this great dreaming, God's own breath is the life force of the humans, and God walked in the garden of delights with the human ones. There was no greed, no competition, no pollution or abuse of the garden's goodness, just mutual reverence and delight. But then the dreaming continued, and a dark shadow entered the story. As humans were not satisfied in being like God and being images of God, they wanted to be God. In this story, they rebelled against the limits God had set and sought limitless freedom. In this, their eyes were opened. Where once there had been intimacy and a shared oneness with creation and each other and God, now they perceived limits and barriers. As they reached out and grasped the fruit, the dreaming was broken with an awakening to human separateness. The garden stopped being so delightful. In the breakout groups, I asked the question, have you considered the opening 2 chapters of Genesis as an expression of God's dream for all creation and all humanity? Once we can let them go as a historical account of what happened, then we can enter into these wonderful dreamtime stories within our Judeo-Christian tradition. What difference does it make being like God and the desire to be God? You might like to pause the video and reflect on that question. But God's dreaming continued. God did not lose faith with creatures or creation. In our story, God reached out into the lives of the people, drawing them into the freedom from slavery in Egypt, giving them guiding rules to know their limitations. These chosen people were to be a sign of what is possible. They were to be a light in a fragile world of competing powers. And over the centuries, competing powers overran God's people, taking them from their land, taking from them their independence, and destroying the temple they built to worship their God. History tells the story of Babylon, then of Persia, of Greece and Rome, all trying to be the supreme ruler. In fact, it seemed that this world was no longer open to God's dream, to God's spirit, and the very heavens were shut. The people cried out in their longing, "Oh, that you would tear the heavens open and come down." Israel's holy men and women, whom we call prophets, tried to keep God's dream alive during a dry, sterile time when hope was in tatters. Against the power of other people's greed, the dream grew fainter and fainter. Around 200 years before the birth of Jesus, when the people of Israel had experienced invasions and conquests again and again, it did seem as if God and God's Spirit could no longer be part of their experience, as God had once been through Moses and David and the prophets. Faced with the continual presence of dominating powers, where it seemed that God's voice had been silenced, these holy men and women began to consider that God's only course of action was to bring this world to an end. And then, when the reign of evil in the world was destroyed, then God could start again. This is the time when the prophet Daniel wrote about the end times. And these end times were to be a time of struggle and conflict, as God did battle with the forces of evil that had overtaken the world and had almost extinguished God's dream. So during this time, the dream shifted to a future time, what they called an end time. It was a time of heightened hope and expectation that God was about to send an anointed one, as God had once sent Moses or David or Elijah. This anointed one was called in Hebrew the Messiah, and in Greek the Christ. He was to be the one to struggle against evil and to be victorious. With his victory, then a new age could begin, a new creation when God's dream could once again flourish. It wasn't really clear who this might be or what he might do, but he would be an agent of God's salvation. He would continue God's dreaming. At the time of Jesus, some in Israel were so convinced that this end time was about to happen, they went down to live by the Dead Sea. These are the people responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. They went down there to prepare for God's arrival and to join with the forces of light against the forces of evil and darkness. Reading the Dead Sea Scrolls is like reading the script of Star Wars with a battle between light and darkness. Then a strange man appeared from the wilderness, calling people to repent and announcing God's time has come. His fame spread throughout the land as crowds went to the River Jordan to be immersed by him as a sign of their renewed commitment. John the Baptist even looked like the prophet Elijah, who was expected to come for God's end time. The dream was about to happen. Then one day, a man from a small village called Nazareth approached John. Like others in the crowd, he was seeking to renew his commitment to God. He went down into the Jordan and his heart was opened. It was as if he saw the heavens open and the Spirit touch him. He knew himself to be a child of God in a new and staggering way. He stumbled from the waters into the nearby hills to spend time alone. Could this experience be real? Was this really the time when the heavens were opening and God's reign was beginning in him? Could he really believe and give himself over to God's dreaming? Well, you know the answer to this one. One man, Jesus, did believe, and he entered into the dream time of God. He emerged from his wilderness time convinced that God's dreaming, often called God's kingdom, was alive and that he was to be the bearer of this dream. And in his faith, strange things happened. Eyes were opened, limbs were healed, minds found peace, and outsiders were made welcome. He spoke from the authority of his own experience, and he spoke of the God he knew, a God who heard the cries of the poor, the lonely, the refugees. Unlike the teachers of the law, Jesus taught from the heart, and his authority was recognized as he was frequently called Rabbi, because Jesus, the Rabbi, taught from experience. Now, there's a passage in the Gospel of Mark that I think should be engraved in every school. Jesus said to his disciples, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. So when Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd. and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Once again, you might take some time to think, what does this passage reveal about Jesus? And why would I consider this passage so important for educators? Jesus' teaching begins from his heart. He felt compassion. He felt the poverty and hunger of the crowd, not just for ordinary food, but for what truly nourishes life. He taught them many things, says the Gospel of Mark. He awakened in his hearers the desire for God's dream, and he shared with them the blessings that are available for those caught up in this dream. He said, blessings on those able to live simply and without envy, able to be generous, knowing their hearts will never be empty. Jesus promised blessings on the poor, when the world around him thought wealth and power was a sign of blessing. Blessings on those who could weep, whose hearts could still be touched with sadness and able to feel the pain and loss of others, rather than live a life with a closed and hardened heart. Blessings on those able to walk gently on earth, treating themselves and others with kindness, rather than those whose arrogance placed expectations and demands on all around them. Jesus spoke of blessings on those who struggle for justice, who have the honesty to know and to say, this is not right. In your discomfort and courage, he promised, you will find God. He said, blessed are those who know the freedom that comes through forgiveness, who can let go their own past failings and the failings of others. They will know God's own love. God's blessing is on the open-hearted, who approach others without the masks of prejudice or expectations, those who can simply be themselves and allow others this same gift. Their heart is undivided, knowing what truly gives life and what is sham. You are blessed if you can bring peace, if you can heal wounds and divisions. You are truly a child of my dreaming. You are blessed when you stand within your own truth and integrity without wavering to pressure. You will know peace of soul and belong to my dreaming. Of course, dreamers make life uncomfortable for the realists. Jesus found himself at odds with the religious leaders of his time who were trying to walk the line of compromise with Roman power. Jesus couldn't and wouldn't compromise. It was easier to kill the dreamer in the hope that the dream would die. So Roman troops and temple police had their way. It seemed to them Rome's empire could soon return to normal. But we know the dream continued, and the dreamer could not be confined to a grave. His spirit infected the lives of his followers. He lived. It really was the end time. God really had intervened, and the world would never be the same again. A new creation had begun, and Jesus was the living proof of what was possible. You know, when I read religious education programs or books or videos, all speaking about the kingdom of God, to me, many of them miss the point. The reign of God, or what I've been calling God's stream, is so watered down to manageable bits. They lose its radical nature. When Christians live this stream, they become dangerous. In this new age, even women's songs were considered too radical. They were dangerous and had to be silenced. Mary had sung, "My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Saviour." She too was in God's streaming and singing it into power. "The Mighty One has done great things for me. His name is holy. God scatters the proud in their arrogance and brings down the powerful from their thrones. And God lifts up the lowly ones, the forgotten ones, and their prayers confront the empires." In 1805, the British Empire's East India Company banned Mary's Magnificat, lest it threatened their power and profits in India. In Argentina, from 1970 onwards, and still today, mothers of the disappeared gather every Thursday to protest the military junta which had disappeared their children. They too were banned from praying Mary's Magnificat in their gatherings. In time, some of these mothers and grandmothers joined the disappeared. In the 1980s, Guatemala banned the Magnificat as a public prayer. The power of empire was no real match for God's dream when it captivated minds and hearts. So today, in our context, I ask, are there signs of God's dreaming in our midst? I see signs of hope when a teenage girl tackles the power of the United Nations and says, "Shame on you." Or when a young woman, Grace Tame, was named the Young Australian of the Year for showing the courage to speak of the abuse she suffered when she was groomed and exploited as a schoolgirl. Her courage in speaking out has set in motion a wave of other women also finding courage to speak of things that should never have happened. And Malala of Pakistan, who wanted a chance to be educated. In speaking of Malala, I'm aware of our sisters in Pakistan. 2 of their schools were bombed. Jesus says, "People who do evil hate the light, so their deeds may not be exposed. Those who do what is true, who act truthfully, need have no fear of light, for light will only reveal they acted in a godly manner." Here, in our time, it's strange and uncomfortable and very challenging to live in such a time when things that were done in darkness are being brought into the light. But it's also allowing something of God's dreaming to be present and revealed, the power of healing truth. So once again, you might take some time to reflect, are there signs of God's dreaming in your midst, even during this COVID time? So here we are today, taking time, giving time to consider God's dream, God's desire for life and living. While all around us, our families, our towns, our state, in fact, our entire global village struggles with an unseen threat, something so tiny it takes a powerful microscope to reveal it, something never seen before, which is making it so very dangerous. This microscopic life has paralysed our world. Now, I must add a little touch of humour to this. Mum, why are humans wearing muzzles? Honey, they're too dumb to learn sit and stay. And then, of course, there's Wilson, the sheepdog, learning to work from home. So 2 years ago, would we have considered that governments would command stay home and that teachers would work from home, teaching without going near the school? Our way of life has been turned upside down by something tinier than a flea. But then I'm reminded that Jesus said something about the power of tiny things, of mustard seeds and yeast. Along with frontline medical carers, society is also beginning to appreciate the difference education makes to life and the complexity of teaching young people day in and day out. I don't think teachers will ever be taken for granted again, or that teaching will be seen as an easy option. Many things about this COVID time are hard, but some people are also catching glimmers of light, touches of kindness, snatches of peace. Is there some learning we could take from this time? Some blessing we could discover? I want to share something of my recent learning. For the past 5 years, I've been working intensely on John's Gospel. Early this year, I received page proofs and so spent time proofreading Volume 1, then doing it for a second time. And then as soon as I thought this was finished, along came Volume 2. It's left me feeling a deep sense of tiredness, with everything being an effort. And for me, the COVID lockdowns have been a bit harder each time. Sunday was the Feast of the Assumption, and I've been watching the Eucharist, participating in Eucharist on the videos of Chris Monaghan, with my own small piece of bread and small glass of wine. Now, this past Sunday, Chris reminded me that in the Eastern liturgy, this Feast of the Assumption is celebrated as the Dormition of Mary, her going to sleep. And the word dormition stayed with me. I felt it was the right word for describing how I've felt these past months. I've been dormant. I felt as if now I could enter into this celebration of the Dormition of Mary, not simply Mary in heaven, but Mary in Caulfield. And it was okay. That those feelings of deep tiredness, of needing a fellow time right now, are not feelings to be fought against, but entered into with kindness to myself and to others. So this enforced stay at home can be a Sabbath time, to stop, to be still, to be more interior than exterior. Chris also shared this reflection from Pope Benedict. Human life is a journey. Toward what destination? How do we find the way? Life is like a voyage on the sea of history, often dark and stormy. A voyage in which we watch for the stars that indicate the route. The true stars of our life are the people who have lived life to the full. They are lights of hope. Recently, I received a light of hope from a young teacher who was in my course this year, a young teacher from Ballarat who wrote, "During the tough times I've experienced of recent, I've questioned my faith and beliefs, just like the initial audience of the New Testaments. However, I continue to remind myself to be hopeful during these challenging times and to have faith that everything will work out just as it is meant to. I understand the importance of having hope and faith, teaching and helping others, and believing in myself. So even as we struggle on this journey, enduring, failing, rising, finding faith, sometimes losing hope and then finding it again, we too can be lights of hope for our school, our neighbourhood, our family, our students. So I finish this reflection leaving you with this question. Is there some human learning, some godly blessing that we could discover? Because we are now the dream bearers of God's dreaming. Thank you.